So as I mentioned in the other slides, when you're developing the skill set of writing for publication, it just takes practice. You know, you've learned how to write, but there are more skills required to learn how to write for publication. So anything that I'm giving you is just kind of a place to start and begin to understand the new skills that you need to develop, and to just recognize that it's going to take trial and error. And so, you know, have the humility to continue to seek help and to continue to find, you know, new insights so that you can understand this process better. So when I'm talking about research for writing for publication, you know, I'm not going to talk about learning any kind of methodology, right? Like your classes are going to teach you that. What I'm talking about more is how to survey the literature to get a grasp on where the conversation is so that you can have something original to offer, because originality is in large part contextual, and it also matters for how you manage to connect it to your audience and what's important to them in some way, shape, or form. And then I also want to talk about kind of this, you know, the creative aspect, or like the generative aspect of writing something that will be useful to someone else. You know, I don't feel like this gets covered very much. And then I also want to talk a little bit about process, right? Like there is a process to writing. It's not linear, and it's not like necessarily a you know, series of lists that you can just check off. There's kind of some reflection that needs to happen in order to begin to have some mastery over it. When we're writing for the class, you know, we're punched for time, you know, we're maybe not as caring about what we're doing, or we're, you know, we just want to make our point and kind of move on with our lives, you know, even if we love what we're doing. But when you're conducting research for a piece of publication that you're submitting to, you know, a body of your peers who have thought about this, you know, researched about it, you know, have distinct ideas and beliefs and opinions about it, you need to put a little bit more time into understanding the complex array of opinions, beliefs, arguments, definings of the problem that are out there. So one of the things that I like to stress is that somebody else has probably already thought of your good idea, and that's okay. You know, at Military Review, we get quite a few articles where it's just very obvious that they just thought of it and then wrote about it without checking to see if somebody else had already made that argument. And you know, it's a little bit humbling, it's a little bit disconcerting, but it's inevitable. It's just part of the process, especially when you're starting out as a writer. You know, it takes 3 to 5 years to have enough to develop that expertise where you'll think of an idea and kind of already know if someone else has thought of it or not. So what I like to say is that that's your starting point, right? Like your idea that you had, that somebody else already had, you know, you got excited about it, right? You were motivated. So, you know, I counsel, hold on to the curiosity and the excitement, and, you know, have the humility to let that carry you through, you know, all the things that seem like obstacles initially. And then the other thing is that, you know, so you've got an idea and you know no one else has thought about it, and you're halfway through writing the paper, you might find that you need to do more research. You know, when you're writing for a class, right? Like, you know, it's, you know, you can, you know, like there's not as much competition for attention as there is in a publication, right? When you're writing for a publication, like you're asking very busy people, very busy professionals for their time. So that means you need to do a lot of legwork, and be willing to go back and do more legwork. Although if you're the OCD type, I'm not talking to you. You don't need any more justification, right there. So there's a limit, right? Like you want to be willing to go and do more research if you realize, like, oh, you know, like I have this point about the State Department, but I don't really know that much about how the State Department works. I need to go in and, you know, maybe figure that out, maybe see if I can interview someone to get kind of an informal understanding and, you know, check out their website, whatever it means to understand the State Department in order to make your point about them more effective. And so a lot of research doesn't actually show up on the paper. It shows up in your grammar and your word choice and your paragraphing as expertise. So even though it doesn't have that, you know, if you research an idea and it doesn't end up in your paper, right, there's not that kind of like easy gratification of having done the research and had it mean something in like, you know, tangible words in the paper. It still shows up, and, you know, from having read dozens of articles, you know, you can definitely tell as an evaluator when someone has done this or not. There is no cut and dried process for going through research, right? Like, this is something that just, you know, you'll learn about this in your class, you'll learn about this from talking to peers, and then you'll learn about it through trial and error. But one of the things that, you know, I like to kind of advise people to do is to have kind of a broad, narrow approach as needed. So, you know, you're entering the conversation on, you know, whatever your topic is. You want to kind of get that big picture understanding first, right? So, you know, if I'm entering the conversation on military discourse, then I need to start with the big names, right? You know, I need to understand Clausewitz, Jomini, etc., right? Like, I get the big picture. Who are the big players? Like, how, you know, what are the big moments in this field over time? And then from there, narrow in as needed, and then broaden back out as needed. And this is, you know, there is no hard and fast, but I think even just understanding the process is something of you're switching from the forest to the trees and back and forth until you've kind of found your orientation is useful. And then, you know, having an understanding of who the major journals are, who the major authors are, you know, that will just serve you. You know, like that kind of understanding just serves you. And doing this practice here, I think, helps in a variety of contexts in your life. And so then from doing this process of kind of like big picture understanding, what are the major moments, into narrow understanding, back out to big picture. One, it's a good way to create ideas. This is a generative process, as well as helping you maybe have an idea of how to do a literature review. So it's a generative process, and then it is also the process for understanding the conversation, right? You know, so, you know, knowing this journal started then, or this author started writing then, or, you know, this is the history of like the big guys and the arguments they've been having with each other. Or, you know, this idea was around in the 50s and then it died and it showed back up again in the 90s, you know, just having those insights from just observing what's going on in the conversation helps give you ideas, makes you look like an expert, and makes you look more convincing. So as you're going through this process of kind of piecing apart the story of what's going on, you'll end up being able to create some kind of narrative or map of the conversation that you can then use in your introduction or, you know, literature review of your paper or throughout your paper. That's actually kind of one of the ways that people show up as very credible in their writing, is they have a credible narrative, and they often introduce something new into the story, you know. And like, you know, like in the military discourse right now, like there's a narrative of Russia, right? And so you could study the narrative of how Russia like shows up in our research articles over the last 2 years and come to some very interesting like insights into like American thinking, and, you know, even just understand like how that like narrative of Russia sets up what the problem is, it sets up what the solution is, like it sets up where people think our attention needs to be, and so on. So, you know, studying the patterns of some topic that's of interest to you helps you understand who your audience is, and gives you a place to kind of take the story that's been happening and put it into your own words in a compelling way. And that's also something that I think is worth looking at when you're researching, right? Like, what is the narrative that this person creates around this topic? And if you use that as a framing question to, you know, a variety of articles, then you can start to establish some patterns that you can bring into your writing. Like, hey, you know, professional peers, like this is what I have observed and this is what I have to say about it. And so again, this is something that I cannot teach you how to do in just a couple minutes, right? Like I need a whole semester just to teach you this alone. But it's something that, I think is a critical skill for writing for publication that maybe doesn't always get taught. So I really encourage you, what are the kinds of groupings, like how do people divide and categorize, right? Like we have the very simple, like pro, con groupings, right? Like everyone kind of knows that, but there are more sophisticated ways that you can group the research to make meaning out of it. And book introductions are a phenomenal model for this. They're also a great place to kind of get oriented to the bigger picture of, the discourse. These authors have spent, months and months and months doing the research for their book, and then they write it to the general audience in their introduction. Right, so it's very comprehensive, very easy. They explain their methodology. It's a great model for understanding how a lot of this stuff works. As I mentioned in the other one, like thesis statements are essential. That is, when someone is reading your paper, they're going to take your thesis sentence and evaluate every paragraph against that thesis sentence, right? So your thesis sentence is the map, or the piece of gold that the rest of your article kind of validates. So you need to be willing to rewrite it. You need to be willing to let your thesis statement change as your research changes. I think that's one of the biggest challenges of learning to write in general, is to be willing to revise your own ideas. And if you can develop this ability, you're more likely to get published, and you're just going to be a better thinker. And so one kind of easy way to make sure your thesis sentence is, as refined as it can be, is to look at your verbs and noun phrases in your thesis, right? Like, can you narrow the thesis down to be more specific? And, you can also have a 2 to 3 sentence thesis if needed. And again, when you're conducting research in order to convey something to your audience, I think it's more useful to think of this as influence than making a grand change. We're really trained in our writing in America to think we need to solve the world all the time. It's just part of how we write, and you're going to be more persuasive if what you're advocating for is manageable or doable in some way, shape, or form. Everyone has a brilliant idea for how the world could be a better place. But what can your brilliant idea offer the reader in that moment? I want to emphasize, audience awareness in doing research is crucial. You're not just writing to an empty room. You're not just writing to your teacher. You're not just writing to your buddies. You're writing to a range of people who think very differently than you do and who are, very educated. So you need to have like kind of a living understanding of who your audience is, to kind of know how to take your research and make it appeal to them with logic, credibility, and an emotional appeal. Like if you're writing about, if you believe in human terrain systems, you have to understand the general, Army opinion of human terrain system in order to, make whatever it is that you've researched effective, right? Like you could spend, months interviewing people, but if you're not taking those interviews and putting them in a framework that's compelling to the beliefs and attitudes around human terrain system, then it doesn't necessarily matter. And then the other point that I want to make is that the final point that I want to make here is that you want to pick your publication venue as early in the process as you can. That way you can study them and research how they use research, as well as integrate articles from that publication into your writing. It's pretty rude to go like, hey, you guys have been having this conversation for years around this topic, but I didn't listen, but here's my idea. That's just not respectful. And it doesn't have to be much. It doesn't have to take a lot of time. You can skim, you can just read the introductions or conclusions or just a little bit of the research, the evidence and reasoning. But I think and you don't necessarily always have to directly reference whomever you're wanting to get published in. Like it's not a one-to-one like that. But having some understanding of, who that publication is important.